Hey guys, this is going to be the quick and dirty video on CPI and PPI. Now remember, this was CPI was consumer, PPI was producer, and then PI in both stands for price index. So CPI is consumer price index, PPI is producer price index. Alright, so CPI measures the average cost for a typical consumer. And PPI measures the average cost for a typical producer. Alright? So, here's next part. PPI is what we call a leading indicator of inflation, and that means it's going to be the first to change before we see anything else change to indicate inflation. Why is that? Because look at this. If there's inflation and things are now more expensive, Nintendo, for example, will have to buy discs to put their video games on at a higher price. So that means their total cost will increase, because now they have to pay more to buy the CDs and make their video games. Since their cost will increase, they're going to increase the price of their games in order to cover that cost. So what's going to happen to us at the CPI, as consumers? Well, since the price of video games increases, the price of video games increased, that means our costs are going to increase. As typical consumers, our costs will increase. So PPI will increase, which will lead to the CPI to increase, which will lead to the GDP deflator to increase. That's how it all works out. When PPI increases, the same happens to the other two, and when PPI decreases, the same happens to the other two. That's CPI and PPI. But now, let's talk about why the CPI is somewhat flawed. The CPI has some problems. So let's talk about those a little bit more in depth. Problem one of the CPI is called the substitution bias. The CPI assumes that you're not going to substitute things if a price of something increases. So, for example, if the price of apples was $2 for 5, and the next year it was $5, oh no, $2 per apple, $2 per, where's my, there it is, $2 per apple, and you bought 5 apples one year. The next year it was $5 per apple and you bought 5 apples. So the next year would be 10, and the original year would be 10. So, truthfully, $10, okay. In the first year, you're willing to fork that up for some apples. But in the next year, they increase so much in price, there's no way you're going to spend that much on apples. Instead, what you're going to do is, you're going to substitute something. For example, you can buy oranges instead now. Maybe they're $2 like apples were last year. So you're going to substitute that and buy oranges instead. The CPI, though, they assume this. They assume you're still going to buy that same exact amount of apples at the new price. It's called the substitution bias. So that's why it overstates inflation. It says inflation's not much higher, but inflation's higher than it actually is. Okay, the next problem of the CPI is called the technology bias. The CPI can't account for a better technology. So for example, one year the laptop you bought was $1,000, and the next year it was $750. It decreased in price by $250. Now, CPI will assume since it got cheaper, that means it's worse now. But the truth of the matter could be that now technology got better, We applied better technology so we could make the computer a cheaper price, or we could make it better, and so we could charge less for it. So the CPI doesn't know that. It assumes that a lower price means a product got worse. Problem number 3 is the outlet store bias. I don't know why this is so. Don't ask me. But it doesn't. The CPI doesn't include outlet stores. Outlet stores. You can Google that. It's just a store that sort of like sells a certain store's clothes. For example, Gap Outlet will sell Gap clothes, but it's not an actual official Gap store. And 4 is expectations. It doesn't. Oh, my bad. Expectations. Um, it's the new product bias. I don't know. I was thinking something else. New product bias. Ooh. The CPI can't account for new products that are available on the market for consumers to purchase because it takes a lot of effort to make the CPI and calculate it, and it takes a lot more effort to update it with the new products coming out every year because there's a ton of products coming out every year. So CPI can't be updated with the new products every year, so it's lagging quite a bit behind. We don't know by how much. Maybe the current CPI measures the average typical cost from 5 years ago. I don't know. But it's definitely lagging behind in time. So CPI, PPI, that's basically it. There's not that much more to it. And if there is, I will make it in a later video and just add it on here. So thanks. Oh, actually, now I remember. Alright, so CPI, one more thing. If the CPI for 1 year was 100, and for the next year was 135, this increase is a 35% inflation rate. When the CPI increases like that, it's 35 inflation rate. And one more thing is this. CPI measures how much an average consumer spends, right? So, CPI is linked to, in the United States, Social Security checks and Social Security. So, here's how that works out, though. For example, let's say in 2009, your Social Security check was $2,000, and the CPI was 100. In 10, the CPI was 110. Your Social Security check is now going to be 2,200. This increased by 10%. So we're assuming inflation increased by 10%. Prices increased by 10%. So we're going to increase this check by 10% in order to balance that out. So that's how that works. But remember we talked about how CPI overstates inflation? So Social Security checks are actually more than they actually need to be, because inflation isn't actually 10%. Because of the faults in inflation, like substitution bias, the outlet store bias, the new product bias, the technology bias, all of that makes a CPI higher than it has to be. So that's a critical point about the CPI. Even then, it's what we're going to use to measure inflation. It's the most reliable source, and that's pretty much all there is to know about it. So keep out for the next video, and stay tuned.